Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. The West cut Moscow off. Sanctions, asset freezes, a campaign to isolate it completely. India didn't join in. Instead, Indian refiners kept buying. By 2024, Russia supplied over a third of India's crude oil, up from barely 2% before the war. By 2025, India had paid Russia tens of billions of dollars for that oil, even as Washington imposed tariffs to punish it for doing so. So why didn't India fall in line? Why does a country that calls itself the world's largest democracy keep standing next to Vladimir Putin while most of the West stands against him? The answer isn't ideology. It isn't even really about Ukraine. It's about something that goes back 75 years. And it explains almost everything about how India sees the world. The beginning, 1947 to 1991. When India became independent in 1947, the world was splitting into two camps, the American-led West and the Soviet-led East. Jawaharlal Nehru refused to pick a side. He called it non-alignment. India would deal with both blocs but bow to neither. On paper, that should have kept India equally distant from both. In practice, it didn't work out that way. The United States tilted toward Pakistan, arming Islamabad through the 1950s military pacts. The Soviet Union, looking for a foothold in South Asia, moved the other way, toward India. Over the next 2 decades, Moscow became something Washington never was for New Delhi, a partner without conditions attached. The foundations of trust. Trust like this isn't built on speeches. It's built on moments where one side shows up for the other when it actually matters. India and the Soviet Union had several of those moments. The first came at the United Nations. From the 1950s onward, on the question of Kashmir, the Soviet Union repeatedly used its veto power at the UN Security Council to block resolutions India saw as hostile to its position, at a time when Western powers were far more sympathetic to Pakistan's case. The second, and arguably the most decisive, came in 1971. As war loomed between India and Pakistan over Bangladesh's liberation, India and the USSR signed the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation in August 1971. Months later, when the United States moved its 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal as a show of support for Pakistan, the Soviet Union countered with its own naval presence and diplomatic backing. India won that war in 13 days. New Delhi has never forgotten which great power stood beside it, and which one didn't. Then came defense. Starting in the 1960s, the Soviet Union began selling India MiG fighter jets, T-series tanks and submarines. And crucially, it offered something the West rarely did: technology transfer and licensed local production. India wasn't just buying weapons, it was learning to build them. That's the origin of India's entire indigenous defense industrial base, decades before Make in India became a slogan. Add to that cooperation on nuclear energy and space technology, and you get a relationship built layer by layer: diplomatic cover, military hardware, and technology across nearly 4 decades. After the USSR, enter Putin. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that foundation suddenly looked shaky. Russia under Boris Yeltsin was broke, distracted, and far less reliable as a partner. For a few years, the relationship drifted. Vladimir Putin changed that. After coming to power in 1999 to 2000, Putin moved quickly to rebuild ties with India. In October 2000, India and Russia signed a declaration on strategic partnership, formalizing a relationship that had until then existed mostly through habit and goodwill. From there, the cooperation expanded rather than shrunk. Nuclear power plants like Kudankulam, continued defense sales, energy deals, and a steady rhythm of annual summits. Putin made India a consistent priority in Russian foreign policy, even as Russia's relationship with the West deteriorated. Modi and Putin, a new era. The personal chemistry mattered too. Narendra Modi's relationship with Putin predates his time as Prime Minister. He visited Russia as Gujarat's chief minister, building ties years before reaching New Delhi. Since 2014, that rapport has translated into one of the most consequential defense decisions of Modi's tenure. The S-400 Triumph air defense deal, signed in 2018, worth over $5 billion. The United States explicitly warned India that buying the S-400 risks sanctions under its CAATSA law, sanctions aimed at countries doing business with Russia's defense sector. India bought it anyway. 3 of the 5 S-400 squadrons have been delivered. The remaining 2 were delayed by the war in Ukraine, but the deal itself was never walked back. Beyond defense, the two countries kept building multilateral architecture together. BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, platforms where India and Russia coordinate on a world order that isn't simply dictated by Washington. Congress era versus BJP era. Here's what's notable. This entire trajectory, from Nehru through Indira Gandhi, through the Congress-led governments of the 1990s and 2000s into the Modi years, shows almost no ideological break. Congress governments built the original Soviet relationship. The BJP-led governments under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and now Modi didn't reverse it. They institutionalized it further through the 2000 Strategic Partnership and its 2010 upgrade to a Special and Privileged Strategic Partnership. Different parties, different decades, different global contexts, but the underlying calculation barely moved. That continuity itself is a clue. This isn't about any one government's preference. It's structural. The Ukraine war, the biggest test. Then came February 2022, and the relationship faced its sternest test yet. The West imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia and expected the rest of the world to fall in line. India didn't condemn the invasion in UN votes. It abstained repeatedly while calling for dialogue and an end to violence without naming Russia as the aggressor. And then came the oil. Before the war, Russian crude made up roughly 2% of India's oil imports. By 2024, that figure had jumped to over a third of India's total crude imports, around 1.7 million barrels a day at points in 2025, with Russia briefly supplying nearly half of India's imports in a single month. The total value of India's crude imports from Russia hit roughly $50 billion in 2024 alone. India's reasoning was framed around national interest. Discounted Russian oil, sometimes $10 to $20 a barrel cheaper than global benchmarks, helped contain inflation for over 1 billion people and ease pressure on India's import bill. Indian officials, including Foreign Secretary Vikram G., repeatedly stated that national interest, not political alignment, was guiding the country's energy purchases. That stance came at a price. In August 2025, the United States imposed an additional 25% tariff on Indian goods, specifically over its Russian oil purchases, on top of existing reciprocal tariffs, pushing India into one of the highest tariff brackets the US applied to any country. Then in November 2025, after Washington sanctioned Russian majors Rosneft and Lukoil, Indian refiners began genuinely diversifying. Russian crude's share of India's imports fell below 25% for the first time in 2 years by early 2026. But notice what didn't happen. India never fully walked away. Even under direct economic pressure from its most powerful partner, New Delhi adjusted at the margins. It didn't abandon Moscow outright. That is strategic autonomy in practice, not neutrality for its own sake, but a refusal to let any single power dictate India's choices. Why Indians continue to trust Russia? Strip away the headlines, and the trust comes down to 4 things repeated across 75 years. 1. Diplomatic backing exactly when it mattered, from Kashmir at the UN to the 1971 war. 2. A defense relationship that didn't just sell India weapons, but helped it build its own, with the Soviet Union and Russia consistently more willing than Western suppliers to transfer technology rather than just hardware. 3. Energy security. especially visible since 2022, where discounted Russian oil became a buffer for India's economy. 4. And maybe most importantly, Russia has never lined up against India on its core security concerns. Not on Kashmir, not on China, not on Pakistan, in the way some Western partners have historically hedged. This is trust built on consistency, not affection. As multiple analysts have pointed out, India's reasoning isn't sentimental. It's transactional in the deepest sense. Russia has reliably served India's interest across 7.5 decades through wildly different global orders. Challenges facing the partnership. But the relationship isn't static, and three pressures are reshaping it right now. First, Russia's growing dependence on China. Battered by sanctions and cut off from Western markets, Moscow has leaned harder into Beijing economically, a relationship India watches uneasily given its own border standoff with China. Second, India's defense diversification is real and accelerating. According to CIPRI's most recent data, Russia's share of India's arms imports has collapsed from 72% in 2010 to 2014 to 55% in 2015 to 2019 to roughly 36 to 40% in the most recent 5-year window, as France and Israel and the United States gain ground. France alone now accounts for around 28 to 29% of India's arms imports. Third, Atmanirbhar Bharat, India's indigenous defense manufacturing push, is steadily reducing reliance on any foreign supplier at all. India's defense exports hit a record high in the financial year ending March 2026, more than 38,000 crore rupees, a sign that India is increasingly building, not just buying. So the relationship isn't deepening in every dimension. It's narrowing toward what Russia does best: legacy systems, certain high-end platforms like the S-400, while India diversifies everywhere else. What happens after Putin? That raises the real long-term question. Does this relationship survive Putin himself? The honest answer is that it probably does, because the relationship was never really about one leader. It predates Putin by half a century, and it's built on interlocking institutions, defense contracts, energy infrastructure, decades of military integration that can't be unwound overnight. Whoever leads Russia after Putin will inherit a country that still needs India as a market and a partner, just as India will still need diversified energy and legacy military support. Geography and interests outlast personalities. That's the bet India's making. Conclusion. 75 years on, the story of India and Russia isn't a story about loyalty for its own sake. It's a story about a country that learned the hard way that international relationships only last when they're built on reliability, not romance. As the old realist line goes, nations don't have permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. India's relationship with Russia is the clearest proof of that doctrine in the modern world. Tested by the Soviet collapse, tested by a new American partnership, tested by a war in Europe, and still standing. The next test is already underway. How India navigates it will tell us a lot about what strategic autonomy really means in a world that increasingly wants everyone to pick a side.